The scent of old mahogany and lemon polish was the first thing you noticed in the Prestonwood Academy library. It was a smell of history, of money so old to have forgotten it was money at all, and simply considered itself the natural state of things. And in the heart of that library, tucked away in a sun-drenched alcove, was a sanctuary within the sanctuary, the chess club. It was a space of hallowed silence, broken only by the soft click of ivory on marble and the almost imperceptible ticking of a brass tournament clock. Samuel Jones knew this space more intimately than any of its members. He knew the groan of the third floorboard from the left, the way the late afternoon sun would catch the dust motes dancing over the main board, and the precise, satisfying weight of the ebony king in his palm. For 3 years, Samuel had been the evening janitor at Prestonwood, and for 3 years, the chess club had been the last stop on his nightly rounds. He would arrive just as they were finishing, the air still thick with concentration, and he would wait. He'd lean his mop and bucket against the carved doorway, his presence as unassuming as a shadow, and he would watch. The members, boys with names like Julian and Chadwick, wore their school blazers like armor and their privilege like a second skin. They moved the pieces with a flick of the wrist, a bored confidence that spoke of years of private tutoring and an ingrained belief that the world was, in essence, a game they were destined to win. And presiding over them all was Mr. Alastair Finch. Finch was not a teacher, but a patron, a wealthy alumnus whose portrait hung in the main hall. He was a man sculpted from condescension, with a thin smile that never reached his pale, calculating eyes. He didn't teach chess. He curated players. He believed the game was a pure expression of intellect, and he believed intellect was a matter of breeding. To him, the chess club wasn't a club. It was a demonstration of a superior lineage. Samuel never made a sound. He simply watched the ghosts of their games on the abandoned boards. He'd see the echoes of a brilliant discovered attack or a clumsy, fatal blunder. He'd run the sequences back in his mind, exploring alternate lines of play, finding the subtle, hidden beauty they had missed in their rush to victory. His hands, callous in the grip of a mop handle, would ghost over the pieces as he wiped down the tables. He'd feel the familiar shapes, the crenellated top of the rook, the sharp mitre of the bishop. These pieces were old friends. They had been his companions through the longest nights of his life, long before he ever set foot in Prestonwood. He owned a single set at home, a worn wooden board his wife, Clara, had given him. It was the only thing he'd kept from their old life. Before the accident, before the grief that hollowed him out and sent him seeking the quiet, monastic life of a night janitor, he and Clara had played every evening. She wasn't a master, but she loved the dance of it, the story each game told. "It's not about winning, Sam," she used to say, her eyes sparkling over the board. "It's about seeing the truth." One Tuesday evening, Samuel arrived a little earlier than usual. A match was in its final, tense moments. Julian Vance, the club's undefeated champion and Finch's prize protege, was locked in a grueling battle. His opponent, a younger boy, was sweating his face pale. The room was silent, a bubble of pure, unadulterated focus. Samuel leaned in the doorway, forgetting for a moment his role as an invisible fixture. He saw the board. He saw it all. He saw Julian's confident posture, the slight smirk playing on his lips. He saw the younger boy's despair. But most of all, he saw the position. He saw the trap Julian was walking into, a beautiful, devastating snare set 3 moves in advance by a seemingly defeated opponent. The boy didn't even realize the power of the cage he'd built. It was an accidental masterpiece. Julian, with a flourish, slid his queen across the board, pinning the boy's rook. A few of the members let out a soft, impressed sigh. It looked like a killing blow. The younger boy flinched, his hand hovering over his king, ready to tip it in resignation. But Samuel saw the truth. He saw the path that Clara would have loved. He took a single, unconscious step into the room. His worn work boot made a soft scuff on the polished floor. Every head turned. It was as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. Mr. Finch's gaze, cold and sharp as splintered ice, landed on Samuel. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice a low, silken threat. He didn't speak to Samuel, but to the room at large, as if addressing a sudden, unpleasant odor. Samuel's eyes were still on the board. He barely registered the hostile stares. The beauty of the position had captivated him. "The night," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. "The night on B8. It saved the game." A beat of stunned silence. Then, a ripple of derisive laughter led by Julian. "The night on B8?" Julian scoffed, leaning back in his chair with theatrical arrogance. "The janitor is a grandmaster, it seems. The night on B8 is a dead piece. It hasn't moved since the opening." Mr. Finch rose slowly from his leather armchair. He walked over to Samuel, his movements deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. He looked Samuel up and down, from his worn boots to his faded gray overalls, a sneer twisting his thin lips. "I believe your duties lie elsewhere. This room, and the intellectual pursuits within it, are for the members of this academy, not for the hired help." The words were meant to sting, to put Samuel back in his place, to remind him the chasm that separated their worlds. And they did sting, but not in the way Finch intended. For Samuel, it wasn't about class or status. It was about the game. It was about the truth on the board that they were all too blind to see. The insult wasn't to him, the janitor. It was to the integrity of chess itself. He met Finch's gaze. His own eyes, usually downcast and quiet, held a steady, deep fire. "With all due respect, sir," Samuel said, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the snickering. "You're all looking at the queen. You're looking at the attack. But the story is the knight. It can fork the king and the queen in 3 moves." Julian actually laughed out loud this time. "Impossible. Show me." Finch held up a hand, stopping him. The smile was gone from his face, replaced by a mask of cold fury. This janitor wasn't just intruding. He was challenging the very foundation of Finch's curated world. He was suggesting that a man who cleaned toilets for a living could see something that his champion, his hand-picked prodigy, could not. It was an existential threat. "We will not be wasting Mr. Vance's time with fanciful delusions," Finch said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word a perfectly enunciated shard of ice. He took a step closer to Samuel, invading his personal space. "You are not to enter this room again while the club is in session. You are to wait outside. You are to remember your place. Now you are asked to leave. I will not ask again." The finality of it hung in the air. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush on Samuel's neck. The boys stared, their faces a mixture of contempt and cruel amusement. To them, this was a moment of sport, the reestablishment of the natural order. Samuel looked at the board one last time, at the forgotten knight, sitting uselessly in the corner. He saw the path to victory as clearly as if it were illuminated by a heavenly light, but it was a path only he could see. He turned, his shoulders slightly stooped, and walked out of the room, the sound of their muted laughter following him down the silent, empty hall. He picked up his mop and bucket, the familiar weight of small, cold comfort. That night, as he cleaned the gleaming floors of Prestonwood Academy, the board was burned into his mind. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound sadness. A sadness of the game they had so carelessly disrespected. The next day, Samuel's resolve had hardened. It was no longer sadness he felt, but a quiet, unyielding sense of purpose. He went about his duties with his usual meticulous care, but his mind was elsewhere. He was replaying the position, not just from last night, but from 100 other games he'd witnessed. He saw their patterns, their shared weaknesses. They were aggressive, technically brilliant, but they lacked soul. They played by the book, but they couldn't read the poetry between the lines. They knew how to attack, but they didn't understand how to listen. That evening, he didn't wait for the club meeting to end. He arrived just as they were setting up. He wasn't carrying his mop or his bucket. He walked straight to the alcove, his footsteps echoing slightly in the expectant silence. Every head turned, just like the night before. But this time, there was no laughter. There was only a cold, wary curiosity. Finch was standing by the main demonstration board, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He saw Samuel, and a look of sheer disbelief crossed his face, quickly replaced by a dark, simmering rage. "I believe I made myself perfectly clear," he hissed. Samuel didn't flinch. He walked past the rows of students and stopped at the main table, the one reserved for the champion. He looked Finch directly in the eye. His voice was calm, devoid of anger or accusation. It was the voice of a man stating an undeniable fact. I was not finished speaking last night, he said. Julian Vance, who had been setting up his pieces, stood up. Look, old man, you need to. Samuel ignored him. His focus was entirely on Finch. You believe chess is a measure of a man's worth, Samuel continued, his voice resonating with a quiet authority that stunned the room into silence. You believe it belongs to you. To this room. You're mistaken. It belongs to anyone who respects it. Finch's face was a mask of thunderous fury. You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this library before I call security and have you fired. I don't want your job, Samuel said simply. I don't want to join your club. I want to play. The audacity of the statement was breathtaking. It was a peasant challenging a king in his own court. The students murmured amongst themselves, their arrogance momentarily forgotten, replaced by a thrilling sense of scandal. This was better than any chess match. Finch stared at Samuel, his mind clearly racing. To refuse would be to admit fear, to suggest that this janitor's challenge was something to be taken seriously. To accept was to invite a public humiliation of the highest order. He looked at Samuel's rough hands, his simple, worn clothing, and a cruel, predatory gleam entered his eyes. He saw an opportunity, not just to dismiss Samuel, but to utterly destroy him, to make an example of him so profound that the natural order would be restored tenfold. You want to play? Finch repeated, a slow, venomous smile spreading across his face. Very well, but you will not waste Mr. Vance's time. Not yet. You see, in this club we have a ladder. You must earn your place. You will play the club's ranked members. You will start at the bottom with our number 5 player, and you will work your way up. If, and I must stress the utter improbability of this, if you manage to defeat them all, then and only then will you have the privilege of being publicly dismantled by Mr. Vance. And when you lose, you will leave this academy and never return. Are those terms acceptable? It was a gauntlet, a public execution. The students grinned. The trap was set. Samuel nodded once. Acceptable. The room was rearranged. A single table was placed in the center. The digital clock was set. Samuel's first opponent was a boy named Peterson, a gangly, nervous sophomore with a reputation for aggressive, unpredictable openings. He sat down opposite Samuel, a smirk plastered on his face. This was a joke, a story he'd be telling for weeks. Good luck, Peterson said, the words dripping with condescension. You're going to need it. Samuel simply nodded and, as Black, waited for Peterson to push his first pawn. The game began. Peterson, as expected, came out swinging, a flurry of early pawn pushes, and knight developments designed to overwhelm and intimidate. The students crowded around, whispering and snickering. Finch stood behind them all, a silent, smug observer. But Samuel was an island, of calm and a sea of contempt. He met Peterson's aggression not with defense, but with a quiet, unshakable logic. He didn't just react to Peterson's moves. He absorbed them. He let the boy punch himself out, making small, almost invisible positional adjustments. He wasn't playing the pieces. He was playing the boy. He saw the overconfidence, the desperation to win quickly and dramatically. 20 minutes in, the snickering had stopped. Peterson's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a bead of sweat on his forehead. His aggressive storm had broken against a wall of quiet granite, and now his position was full of holes, his pieces scattered and uncoordinated. Samuel, with the patience of a glacier, began to advance. His moves were not flashy or brilliant. They were simple. They were correct. They were undeniable. He didn't capture pieces with flourish. He simply removed them from the board, like a man clearing away clutter. The checkmate, when it came, was so subtle that half the room didn't even see it until Samuel gently stopped the clock. Silence. A deep, profound, and deeply uncomfortable silence. Peterson stared at the board, his face flushed with shame so intense it was almost visible. He had been taken apart, not by a grandmaster's thunderbolt, but by a janitor's quiet, methodical tidying. Next, Samuel said, his voice level, as he reset the pieces. The number 4 player, a more cautious and strategic thinker, sat down. There was no smirk this time. There was a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. This game was different. It was a slow, grinding affair, a battle of intricate maneuvers and long-term plans. The students watched, their initial amusement now curdled into a tense, anxious curiosity. They saw their teammate, one of their best, being slowly and systematically suffocated. Samuel created a weakness on the queen's side, a tiny, almost insignificant pawn weakness, and for the next 30 moves, he nurtured it, cultivated it, until it grew into a gaping, fatal wound that consumed the entire board. Another win. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The air was thick with tension. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was a reckoning. The number 3 and 2 players fell in turn, each one defeated by a different facet of Samuel's impossibly deep understanding of the game. He played with a style they had never encountered. It was part classical strategy, part hypermodern theory, and part something else entirely, a deep, intuitive feel for the harmony of the pieces, a philosophy of balance that he seemed to pull from the very air around him. Finally, it was Julian Vance's turn, the club champion, Finch's protege. He sat down at the board, his face a pale, tight mask of controlled fury. This was no longer about teaching a lesson. This was about defending his honor, his title, his entire world. The students pressed in, barely breathing. Finch stood directly behind Julian, his arms crossed, his eyes burning holes into the back of Samuel's head. The game that followed was a masterpiece of tension. Julian played with vicious, focused brilliance, throwing every complex tactic and memorized opening line. He knew it, Samuel. For the first time, Samuel seemed to be on the defensive, his pieces pushed back, his king's position looking precarious. Finch allowed himself the faintest glimmer of a smile. The natural order was reasserting itself. Julian was a predator, and he had his prey cornered. He launched a massive attack, sacrificing a bishop to tear open the files around Samuel's king. It was a spectacular, crowd-pleasing move. But Samuel didn't panic. He looked at the carnage on the board, and in the midst of the chaos, he saw a single, quiet path. He found the one move, the only move that held the position together. It was a simple king shuffle, a move of retreat, so humble and unassuming that Julian almost laughed. It looked like the last gasp of a dying man. But it wasn't retreat. It was a realignment. With that one quiet move, Samuel had subtly rewired the entire defensive structure. Julian's brilliant attack, which had been aimed at a king on g8, was now useless against a king on h7. His sacrificed bishop was gone for nothing. His queen was suddenly overextended, his pieces out of position. He had punched a ghost. The momentum of the game shifted. In an instant, it was like watching a tidal wave recede, revealing the bedrock beneath. Samuel's pieces, which had seemed passive and defensive, were now perfectly poised for a counterattack. He moved with a newfound speed and precision. A rook swung across the board. A knight leaped into the heart of Julian's position. A pawn began a slow, inexorable march toward the final rank. Julian fell apart. His composure cracked, his moves becoming desperate and sloppy. He was no longer playing the board. He was playing the ghost of his own hubris. Checkmate. Samuel stopped the clock. The room was utterly, completely silent. Julian Vance, the undefeated champion, sat frozen, staring at the pieces that spelled out his utter annihilation. He didn't look angry. He looked broken. He slowly raised his eyes and looked at Samuel, and for the first time, he wasn't looking at a janitor. He was looking at a master. He stood up, knocked over his chair in his haste, and fled the room. Only one opponent remained, Mr. Alistair Finch. Finch walked to the table, his face ashen. The confidence, the sneering superiority, was gone. In its place was a cold, pure, terrified hatred. He had orchestrated this spectacle to confirm his own worldview, and instead, it had been systematically dismantled before his very eyes by a man in overalls. He sat down, his movements stiff and robotic. He looked across the board at Samuel. This was not just a game of chess anymore. This was a defense of his entire life, his beliefs, his status, his very identity. "You will not win," Finch whispered, the word a prayer and a threat. "The board will decide," Samuel replied, his voice still a sea of calm. The final game began. Finch played with a cold, desperate precision. He abandoned all pretense of style or sportsmanship. He played for tricks, for cheap shots, for any small, ugly advantage he could find. He was no longer the curator of a beautiful game. He was a street fighter trying to land a lucky punch. But Samuel was untouchable. He saw every trap before it was set. He navigated the complexities with an effortless grace. He played with the spirit of Clara, with a love for the game's hidden truths. The turning point came deep in the endgame. It was a position of near-perfect equality. Finch, through sheer grit, had managed to simplify the board down to a king and pawn ending that should have been a draw. A draw would be a moral victory for him. He could claim he held the line. He offered it with a curt nod. A draw, a respectable result. Samuel looked at the board, then at Finch. He saw the man's desperation, his desperate need for this small concession to salvage his shattered pride. And Samuel denied him. He shook his head gently. There is still a game to be played. Finch's face contorted in rage. There is nothing. It's a dead draw, you fool. Is it? Samuel asked softly, and he made his move, a single pawn push, a move that seemed to do nothing. But it was everything. It was a move of such profound, subtle genius that it would be studied for years, had there been anyone there capable of truly understanding it. It created a situation known as a zugzwang, a position where any move Finch made would fatally weaken his own position. He was trapped not by an attack, but by his own obligation to move. Finch stared at the board, his breath catching in his throat. He saw it. He finally saw the terrifying, inescapable truth that Samuel had seen 5 moves earlier. He had to move as king, and whichever way he moved, Samuel's pawn would march to the other side and become a queen. He was utterly, completely, and hopelessly lost. He could delay it for a few moves, but the outcome was as certain as gravity. The silence in the room was a living thing. The students watched, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. They were witnessing the public execution of a god. Finch's hand trembled as it hovered over his king. He could not bring himself to make the final, damning move. The clock ticked, each second a hammer blow against his crumbling ego. His perfectly ordered world, his lineage, his intellect, it had all been a lie. He had been beaten, not just on the board, but in a fundamental, spiritual way. He had been shown a truth he could not comprehend. Finally, with a choked sob of pure, unadulterated humiliation, Alistair Finch did the one thing he had never done in his life. He tipped over his own king. It fell with a soft, pathetic clatter onto the marble board. The game was over. Samuel Jones looked at the fallen king. He felt no triumph, no elation. Only a quiet, somber sense of justice. He stood up from the table. He did not say a word. He simply walked over to the doorway, retrieved his mop and his bucket, and began his nightly rounds, started with the very room where he had just dismantled an empire. The students parted for him as if he were a king, their eyes filled with respect that bordered on reverence. Alistair Finch sat motionless, a hollowed-out man, staring at the ruins of his world on a 64-square board. Samuel Jones, the janitor, mopped the floor around him, his movements as steady and methodical as ever, leaving the polish wood gleaming in his wake. He had not come to join their world. He had come to remind them that true worth is not found in a title or a blazer, but in the quiet dignity of a life lived with honor, and in the wisdom to see the truth, even when it's hidden in plain sight. The stories that matter most are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are whispered in the silent halls of power, spoken not with words, but with irrefutable action. Samuel Jones sought no throne. He only sought respect for the truth. He reminded a room full of privileged boys and one very powerful man that brilliance is not a birthright. It is a light that can be found in the most unexpected of souls, burning quietly, waiting for its moment to shine. It is a timeless lesson that in the great game of life, it is not your station that defines you, but the integrity with which you play your position. For more stories that champion the underestimated and expose the arrogance of unearned power, subscribe to our channel and join a community that believes in the victory of truth over privilege.